This portrait hung in the royal palace in Madrid. It was painted to prove that the dynasty was healthy. The man in it is Charles II, King of Spain, master of an empire on which the sun never set. The painter, Juan Carreño de Miranda, was allowed to see him and forbidden to lie too much. So he softened the eyes. He shortened the chin. He could not fix the mouth. Charles II could not close his own mouth. His lower jaw sat so far forward that his upper and lower teeth never met, and he could not chew his food. He was fed soft meals for his entire adult life. He ruled a quarter of the known world. He could not bite bread. That jaw was not an accident of one man. It had been arriving for 200 years, marriage by marriage, contract by contract, through the most powerful family in Europe. And every single one of them could see it coming. Look at the portrait again, and notice what a court painter was paid to do in that century. He was paid to flatter. Carreño did flatter, and he still produced one of the most honest medical documents of the age. The heavy lower lip hangs open. The chin pushes forward past the upper face. The eyes sit dull under lids that never quite lift. Nothing in that painting is a caricature. Every line of it was approved by the household of the man it shows. The condition has a clinical name today. Physicians call it mandibular prognathism, an overgrowth of the lower jaw that pushes it beyond the upper one. In a mild form, it is common enough and harmless. In Charles, it was extreme. The bite never closed. Food could not be ground between the molars because the molars never touched. Servants brought him meals cooked to softness, cut small, sometimes little more than broth and pulped meat, and they did this for 38 years without a single exception recorded. His tongue was described by those who attended him as too large for the space it had. That made his speech thick and slow. Ambassadors who were granted an audience wrote home that they understood almost nothing he said, and that a servant of the chamber had to repeat his words for them. Think about what that means at a working court. The most powerful man in the Spanish world needed an interpreter to be understood in his own language. The rest of the body matched the face. He walked late, badly, and with support. He tired after short distances. He suffered stomach complaints and intestinal trouble that no treatment of the century touched. He had seizures. Through all of it, his signature appears on state papers for more than 3 decades, and the papers were real, and the empire they governed was the largest on earth. That empire is worth naming because the scale is what makes the story unbearable. Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, Milan, the Philippines on the far side of the world, Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, and almost every colony from the deserts of the north to the southern tip of the Americas. Gold and silver crossed an ocean each year to fund it. And the man whose name sat at the top of every one of those documents could not be shown to a foreign visitor without preparation and could not eat solid food. This is the story of where that body came from. Not a legend, not a rumor spread by enemies of Spain. A documented physical inheritance, visible in 5 generations of paintings the family commissioned itself, and produced by a policy the family wrote down and signed. 13 marriages. That is the number at the center of everything you are about to hear. 13 unions inside one bloodline arranged across 2 centuries, each one a reasonable decision on the day it was made. What follows is what that jaw did to the child who inherited the worst of it, what the court around him did in return, and what the whole arrangement finally cost an empire that owned half the world. It begins in a bedroom in Madrid in autumn, the 6th of November, 1661. The Alcazar Palace was cold that time of year, and the birth chamber was kept warmer than the rest of it, shuttered, thick with the smoke of candles and the smell of hot linen. Outside the door stood men whose entire careers depended on what came out of that room. Philip IV was 56 years old and had buried son after son. The empire needed a boy. It had needed one for years, and the need had become something close to panic. The boy arrived alive. That was the first mercy, and the last one for a long while. The physicians examined him and wrote almost nothing. That silence is the loudest document of the whole day. Court doctors of that period recorded everything: the color of an infant, the vigor of the cry, the shape of the limbs, because a healthy heir was news worth writing down at length. Here they gave a few lines. The announcement to the kingdom said the prince was strong and well-formed. The wet nurses who were brought in knew otherwise within a week, because the child could not feed properly. He tired at the breast. He could not take hold. They brought in more women, and more after that, and the accounts of the household show payments to a stream of them through his early years. Nobody wrote that down. Somebody remembered it. Picture the mother in that room. Mariana of Austria was 27 years old, and she was not only the Queen of Spain, she was her own husband's niece. Her mother was Philip IV's sister. That fact was public, legal, blessed in advance by the church, and considered a triumph of diplomacy when the marriage was arranged. She had already buried children. Now she held the one who would have to survive, and she was told he was strong and well-formed, and she watched him fail to feed. Here is the part that reaches past the 17th century and past kings entirely. Every parent who has ever waited outside a door for news about a child knows the exact silence that filled that palace. The moment when the people who are supposed to explain things go quiet and start choosing their words. The words chosen in Madrid that November were careful ones. Careful words in a birth chamber have meant the same thing in every century. The court celebrated anyway. Bells, processions, a Te Deum, fireworks over the city. The empire had its heir, and the empire was told nothing else. He was baptized Charles, after the great emperor of his house, and the name was the heaviest thing they could have put on him. Charles V had ruled from the Atlantic to the plains of Central Europe. Charles V had also complained, in his own words, that he could not close his mouth and that he chewed badly, and had blamed it for the digestive misery of his later years. The same face, separated by 130 years and 5 generations of the same family. That is the thread to hold on to through everything that follows. One lower jaw, painted again and again by the finest artists money could buy, passed down a family line like a title. Maximilian I carried it. Charles V carried it and wrote about the trouble it gave him. Philip II wore a beard that did nothing to hide it. Philip IV sat for Velasquez with the same heavy chin and the same hanging lip, and Velasquez did not remove it because the family did not want it removed. They were proud of it. It marked a man as one of theirs. By the time it reached the child born that November, it had stopped being a family resemblance and had become something a physician had to manage daily. The infant was carried through the palace to be shown. Courtiers bowed to a bundle of cloth and saw very little of what was inside it, and that pattern held for years. He was not paraded. He was not displayed at windows. Foreign ambassadors in Madrid began sending home the same sentence in different wordings, that they had not been permitted to see the prince closely, and that those who had would not describe him. The empire had its heir. The empire did not get to look at him. And the thing that shaped his face was already old on the day he was born. It had a starting point, an exact one, a document with signatures and seals, drawn up in an age before anyone in Europe had heard of Madrid as a capital. A marriage contract from 1496 between a young Austrian prince and a Castilian princess. An arrangement that gave a minor Alpine family the largest empire in the world without a single battle, and taught that family the lesson it would never unlearn. Marriage was cheaper than war. The House of Habsburg began as a minor Alpine family with a castle in what is now Switzerland and no claim to anything worth having. They held some land in Austria. They had a title in the Holy Roman Empire that meant less than it sounded. Nothing about them in the 1400s suggested they would end up owning the largest empire the world had ever seen. They never conquered Spain, they married it. In 1496, a young Austrian prince named Philip, called Philip the Handsome because he was, and because the name would become almost cruel in hindsight, was married to Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. It was a straightforward diplomatic arrangement against France. Joanna was the third child in line. Nobody in the negotiating room expected her to inherit anything. Then her brother died. Then her older sister died. Then her sister's only son died. Within 6 years, a girl who had been a minor bargaining piece became the heiress of Castile, Aragon, Naples, and everything Columbus had claimed across the Atlantic. And the whole of it passed, through her, into the hands of an Austrian family that had not lifted a sword to get it. That was the lesson. It was learned completely, and it was never forgotten. The family motto that emerged from those years said it without embarrassment: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." The most successful conquest in European history was carried out with ink. What arrived with the inheritance was something else entirely, and it arrived in the paintings. Look at Maximilian I, Philip's father, the emperor who arranged the whole thing. Every portrait of him shows a long lower face and a chin that pushes forward past the line of the upper lip. Court painters of the 1400s worked to flatter. They flattered everything about him except the jaw, because the jaw was not something a brush could argue with. His grandson made it famous. Charles V ruled more territory than any European since the Romans. Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, half of Italy, the German lands, and the Americas on top. He was the most powerful man alive, and he could not eat properly. His lower jaw sat so far forward that his mouth would not close. He complained about it himself. He said he chewed badly, that he swallowed food before it was ready, and he blamed that habit for the stomach trouble and the gout that wrecked the last years of his life. Titian painted him with the mouth shut as tight as the anatomy allowed, and even then, the chin gives it away. Philip II inherited it and grew a beard over it. The beard changed nothing. The profile is identical. Philip III had it. Philip IV sat for Velázquez again and again over 30 years, and Velázquez, the most honest brush in Europe, recorded the heavy lip, the forward chin, the long, pale face, without once softening the line. The family did not ask him to soften it. They wanted it visible. That jaw was proof of legitimate blood in a century when a claim to a throne could be argued from a face. 5 generations. The same lower face, painted by the finest artists money could hire, hung deliberately in the galleries of the family that carried it. Here is what produced it, and this is the first hard fact of the story. Between the marriage of 1496 and the end of the dynasty in 1700, the Spanish Habsburgs concluded 13 marriages inside their own bloodline. Not 13 marriages in total, 13 marriages between close relatives. 9 of those were unions of uncle and niece, or of first cousins. The most consistent breeding policy in European royal history, applied for 200 years by people who kept meticulous written records of exactly who was related to whom. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the thumbs up costs you nothing and tells the algorithm to keep sending it. Every one of those 13 decisions was defensible on the day it was signed. A foreign bride brought a foreign family with claims. A cousin brought nothing but land the family already held. Marrying inward kept the inheritance from splitting, kept the Netherlands attached to Spain, kept Austria and Madrid speaking as one voice against France. The logic was sound. The logic was also, generation by generation, closing a circle that had no exit. And the cost of it was paid in a nursery. Philip IV married twice, and the second marriage is the one that matters. Mariana of Austria was his sister's daughter, his own niece, 30 years younger than him, originally engaged to his son. The son died at 16, so the father took the bride. Rome approved it, the courts approved it, and Madrid celebrated it as a masterstroke of policy. Then the children began to arrive, and then they began to leave. Margarita survived and was married away to Vienna and died at 21. Maria Ambrosia lived 15 days. Felipe Prospero, the child everyone had waited for, the boy Velasquez painted with amulets and bells sewn onto his clothing to ward off illness, died at 3 years old, in convulsions, 4 months before Charles was born. Fernando Tomas lived less than a year. Coffin after small coffin left the Alcazar and traveled the short road north to the Escorial, into the vault where the family stacked its dead in marble drawers. Consider what that meant for the woman in the middle of it. Mariana of Austria came to Madrid at 15 to marry a man she had been raised to call uncle. By the time she was 30, she had carried 5 children and buried most of them. She wore black almost continuously. She had a nun's headdress rather than a queen's hair in every portrait made of her after the first years, and she was not yet middle-aged. Any mother who has stood in a room where a small coffin is being closed knows precisely what those years did to her, and no crown in Europe changed a single hour of it. She was the most powerful woman in the Spanish world, and she could not keep 1 child in 5 alive. That was the household into which the last Habsburg king of Spain was born. So here is where the story stands. A minor Austrian family won an empire through one marriage in 1496, and then spent 200 years marrying inward to keep it 13 times over. And the same forward jaw appears in every commissioned portrait from Maximilian to the child born in 1661. But nobody in Madrid could explain why the children kept dying. They had physicians, astrologers, relics, and the finest medical faculty in Europe at Salamanca, and not one of them ever wrote down the connection between the marriage contracts and the coffins. What none of them had was the arithmetic, because there is a number that measures exactly how closely 2 parents are related, and when that number is run on Charles II, it does something no other royal figure in recorded history has ever done. To understand it, you have to draw his family tree. A normal family tree at 5 generations back holds 32 distinct ancestors. Everyone has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on, doubling every step backward. That doubling is what makes a bloodline wide. Charles II did not have 32. The same names appear in his tree over and over, in different positions, sometimes 3 and 4 times each. His father's grandparents and his mother's grandparents are largely the same people. His parents were uncle and niece. Both of his grandmothers descend from the same handful of individuals within 3 steps. The tree does not widen as it goes back. It narrows, folds, and returns on itself. The genealogists who reconstructed it in the last century found something they had not expected. On paper, Charles II was the child of an uncle and his niece. On the arithmetic, his parents were closer than that, closer than most brothers and sisters. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the marriage of 1649, and everything to do with a second line in his mother's family that doubles back on itself in a way that changes the entire picture. But that is not even the strangest part. In the last century, a team of geneticists in Spain did something no one in Madrid had ever thought to do. They took the family archives of the Spanish Habsburgs, the marriage contracts, the baptismal registers, the genealogies the family itself had commissioned to prove its own purity, and they rebuilt the pedigree of Charles II backwards, generation by generation, for 16 generations. More than 3,000 individuals should have appeared in that reconstruction. That is the arithmetic of ordinary human descent, doubling at every step. What they found instead was a very short list of names, repeating. Joanna of Castile, the woman married off in 1496, the woman history remembers by the cruel name Joanna the Mad, appears in the pedigree of Charles II again and again. She is his great-great-grandmother by one path. She is his great-great-grandmother by another. She is his ancestor along more than a dozen separate lines of descent, because her children and her grandchildren married each other's children and grandchildren for 200 years. The same is true of her husband, Philip the Handsome. The same is true of Charles V and of Isabella of Portugal, who were themselves first cousins. The tree does not branch outward. It braids back into itself over and over, until the same handful of 17th century faces occupy hundreds of positions that should have belonged to hundreds of different people. Geneticists have a measurement for exactly this. It is called the coefficient of inbreeding, and it expresses the probability that any given pair of genes in a person came from the same single ancestor by 2 different routes. For a child of unrelated parents, it sits near nothing. For a child of first cousins, it rises to about 6 in 100. For a child born to a brother and a sister, or to a parent and their own child, the closest union biologically possible, it reaches 25 in 100. That figure is the theoretical ceiling of human consanguinity. Nothing is supposed to go above it. The coefficient calculated for Charles II came out higher. His parents were an uncle and his niece, a union that on its own should have produced a figure around 12 or 13 in 100. The full reconstruction put him past 25, higher than a child of a brother and a sister, higher than the ceiling, reached not by one forbidden act, but by 2 centuries of perfectly legal, perfectly documented, church-approved marriages between people who were never siblings and never did anything the law of their time forbade. That is the finding, and it stands as the most extreme case ever measured in a documented royal lineage anywhere in the world. No single generation caused it. Every generation added a layer, and layers compound. Understand what this means about the record. This was not hidden knowledge. Each of those 13 marriages required a papal dispensation because canon law prohibited unions within close degrees of kinship, and the Church had prohibited them for the plainest of reasons: the observed consequences. To get permission, the family had to submit the exact relationship in writing to Rome. They had to name the shared grandparents. They had to argue why the prohibition should be set aside in their particular case. Rome granted them, every time. The dispensations survive, and they read like the most damning paperwork in European history. A family formally documenting, over and over, in its own hand, how closely related the bride and groom already were, and then proceeding. The ambassadors saw the results and reported them without mercy. Venice kept the sharpest eyes in Europe on Madrid, and Venetian dispatches note the sickliness of the heirs across 3 reigns. The French court collected the same information. Everyone in the diplomatic world of the 1600s understood that the Spanish royal children did not live, and several of them wrote openly that the cause was the marrying of relatives. The knowledge existed outside the palace walls. Inside them, the calculation never changed. A foreign bride meant a foreign claim on the inheritance, and the inheritance was worth more than the children. And so the boy grew up inside the consequence. Charles did not walk until he was somewhere between 4 and 8 years old, depending on which account you believe. And the accounts disagree because the household deliberately kept the matter vague. He was carried. Nurses and dwarfs of the court held him upright. He was breastfed far past the normal age because chewing was beyond him, and the household payroll records the wet nurses year after year after year. He was not given a proper tutor until very late, on the reasoning, stated by his own mother's advisors, that lessons would strain a body that could not afford strain. So the heir to the largest empire on earth reached adolescence barely literate, and the men who ruled in his name found that convenient. Then he became king at 3 years old, and the treatment began in earnest. Picture a chamber in the Alcazar, shutters closed, a boy on a bed surrounded by the finest physicians in Spain. They bleed him from the arm because the humors are out of balance. They purge him because the stomach is weak. They apply hot irons, blistering plasters, and pigeons split open and laid on his head to draw the sickness out. A real prescription, recorded, used on him more than once. Between treatments, they bring relics from the monasteries, the incorrupt body of a saint carried into the room and placed beside him. Every man in that chamber is certain he is helping. Not one of them ever asks the boy how he feels, because the boy is the object of the procedure, never a participant in it. That is the part of this story that has nothing to do with kings. Anyone who has lain in a bed while professionals discussed their body over their head, in words chosen not to be understood, knows that particular helplessness, the treatment happening to you rather than with you. He lived inside it from the age of 3, and he never once had the standing to refuse. The treatments failed, and when medicine failed, the court reached for the only remaining explanation. By the 1690s, Charles was a grown man with 2 marriages behind him and no child from either. The succession of the Spanish Empire depended entirely on his body producing an heir, and his body would not. Since the physicians had exhausted their science, his confessor and a faction at court arrived at a different diagnosis. The king was bewitched. Someone had placed a spell on him, poison in chocolate, a charm buried under his chamber, the ashes of a corpse mixed into his food. Exorcisms were performed on the King of Spain, not once and not privately. A Dominican inquisitor was brought in. Rituals were carried out over him in his own apartments. Confessions were extracted from nuns in Asturias who were said to have cursed him. He was made to drink preparations meant to expel a demon, and they left him retching for days. All of it was official, all of it was recorded, and all of it was carried out with the full authority of the Church on a man whose only condition was written into his bones before he drew breath. He submitted. He believed it, at least partly, because everyone he trusted told him it was true, and because it offered him something the physicians never had: a reason. A spell can be broken, A pedigree cannot. From the exorcisms came the name. The court began calling him, in Spanish, el hechizado, the bewitched. It was meant as a diagnosis, and it functioned as a verdict, and it attached itself to him so completely that 300 years later, almost every history book still prints it beside his name, as though the word were a title he had earned, rather than an accusation the people around him invented to explain their own failure. That is how he entered history, as the bewitched king, the last of his line, the man whose body had ended a dynasty. The name was wrong in every particular, and the evidence that it was wrong was sitting in the palace the whole time, in his own handwriting, in the letters he wrote, in what the people who actually spoke with him privately recorded about the mind behind that face.
This part of the story hits different when you realize nobody was confused. The family wrote it all down. They read the contracts and understood what would happen to their children and signed anyway, 13 times across 2 centuries. Marriage was cheaper than war, and children were cheaper than marriage. I keep thinking about Mariana, the most powerful woman in Spain, watching small coffins leave the palace, knowing her own name was on the contracts that caused it. The only thing that could have saved those children was someone in her family saying no. No one ever did. Charles made it through. His body broke, but his mind survived the bleedings and the exorcisms. So what happens when someone that intelligent finally understands he was not cursed but designed this way, built into the bone? Tell me in the comments.
There is one more document about this king, and it was not written until the day after he died. It describes the inside of his body in detail. It was produced by men who had spent 30 years failing to treat him, and what it recorded has been argued over by physicians ever since. That document comes later. One thing is worth saying now, and it is the question this whole story keeps circling. The men who signed those marriage contracts were not ignorant, and they were not cruel by the standards of their own time. They simply valued the inheritance above the children who would carry it. If you think you know what you would have done in their place, put it in the comments, because historians still cannot agree on whether this was blindness or a calculation made with open eyes. Now back to Madrid, and to what was done to the living man. The most detailed physical descriptions of Charles II were not written by his doctors. They were written by foreign spies, and they were mailed abroad as military intelligence. Every major court in Europe kept an ambassador in Madrid, and every one of those ambassadors understood that his single most valuable task was to report on the body of one man. The Spanish Empire had no heir. Whoever inherited it would become the dominant power on the continent. So the length of the king's life had become the central strategic variable of European politics, and grown men in embassies measured it the way a farmer measures a failing crop. They wrote about his walk. They wrote about his color, his appetite, whether he had hunted that month, whether his hands shook at the audience. The French ambassador reported that the king had trouble standing without support, and that his face swelled in the evenings. A papal envoy sent home a description of the jaw and the difficulty of understanding his speech. The Venetians noted every fever, every fall from a horse, every day he did not appear. Consider what that meant in practice. A man walks into a room, bows to his sovereign, exchanges courtesies, withdraws, and then goes to a desk and writes down how ill that sovereign looked, seals it, and sends it 1,000 miles to a king who is waiting for him to die. Charles knew this was happening. Everyone at court knew. Ambassadors were sometimes deliberately shown him on a good day, dressed and propped and rehearsed, precisely because the household understood that the report would be written the moment the man left the room. The kindest thing any of them wrote about him was that he was patient. Inside the palace, the treatment continued, and the treatment was in many ways worse than the illness. 17th century Spanish medicine rested on the four humors, and every disorder was read as an excess to be drained. So they drained him.
Bleeding from the arm, bleeding from the foot, leeches, cupping,
Repeated through his adult life, applied at the first sign of fever, applied again when the fever failed to break. A man who could not chew solid food and lived largely on broth was being systematically emptied of blood by the best credentialed physicians in the Spanish world. The purges came alongside, emetics to force vomiting, harsh preparations to empty the bowels, courses that ran for days at a time. His digestion had been poor since infancy. The treatment guaranteed it would never recover. Then there were the remedies that had no basis at all. Freshly killed pigeons split open and pressed to his head to draw out heat. Warm animal entrails laid on his abdomen. The bodies of saints carried into his bedchamber and placed beside him overnight. The same relics used on his half-brother years before, with the same result. Not one of these things helped him. Every one of them was applied by men convinced they were performing the highest medicine available on earth, and the king submitted to all of it, because a Spanish king did not refuse his physicians. His marriages were run on the same principle. He was not a husband to the court. He was a mechanism, and the only output that counted was a child. Marie-Louise of Orleans arrived from France in 1679. She was 17, niece of Louis XIV, and she had wept openly when told where she was going. What she found in Madrid was a court that watched her body as closely as the ambassadors watched her husbands. Her cycles were monitored. Her diet was managed. Each month that passed without an announcement was noted by every embassy in the city. She found something else, too, and it complicates the story in the only direction that matters. Charles was devoted to her. He arranged entertainments for her, tolerated her French habits against the fury of the old Spanish nobility, and, by every surviving account, he loved her without reservation for 10 years. The court did not care. The court blamed her. 10 years without a pregnancy, and the whispering settled on the queen that she was barren, that she was working against Spain, that she was French. She grew heavy and unhappy. She was watched constantly, and she died suddenly in 1689 at 26 after severe abdominal pain. Poison was rumored immediately, and it has never been proven, and appendicitis is the likeliest answer. Charles was reportedly inconsolable. His advisors gave him a few months and then began negotiating the next marriage. Maria Anna of Neuburg came from Germany in 1690, chosen for one stated reason above all others. Her mother had borne many children, so the family was considered fertile stock. That was the argument written down in the negotiations. She turned out to be shrewd, avaricious, and openly contemptuous of a husband who could not defend her, and she spent a decade extracting money and positions for her German circle while the empire drifted. She announced pregnancies that were not real. The court chose to believe them for as long as it was convenient. Blame moved from the first wife to the second, and never once, in 20 years of documented speculation, did it settle where it belonged, on 13 marriage contracts signed before either woman was born. By the middle of the 1690s, Charles was in his 30s and looked far older. He had lost most of his hair, his legs swelled, he fell frequently. He had periods of confusion after seizures, followed by weeks of complete lucidity in which he read state papers and understood exactly what was being decided around him. The exorcisms had already been carried out on him. The reigning king of Spain, held down and prayed over, made to drink foul preparations to expel a demon that did not exist. And then the physicians and the confessors came to him again with another proposal, another examination, another course of treatment to determine once and for all what was blocking the succession of the empire. For once, the man on the bed answered them. What he said was written down by a witness in the room, and it is the single most human sentence to survive from his entire life. But the strangest part of this story is not what he said that day. It is what they found inside him when they finally opened his body. The letters survive. That is the fact that undoes 3 centuries of caricature, and anyone can look at them. Charles II wrote in his own hand throughout his reign. The script is uneven, the letters lean and stagger, and the line drifts downward on the page as the muscles tired. Some of the later documents took him a long time to complete. What matters is that he completed them. The Spanish crown had a legal instrument called the stamp, a device that could apply the royal signature without the king lifting a pen, used routinely for monarchs who were absent, ill, or indifferent. His ministers proposed it to him more than once, and it would have spared him considerable pain. He refused it. For 35 years, on the great majority of state papers, the signature is his own hand and nobody else's. That refusal is not a small thing. Every man in that palace had an interest in a king who signed nothing, and several of them spent their careers trying to produce one. Councils were arranged around him. Documents were placed in front of him already agreed, and still he insisted on hearing ministers speak directly rather than receiving their conclusions in summary. And he sat through sessions of the Council of State that lasted for hours while his legs swelled and his hands shook. The people who actually spoke with him privately came away with a different man than the one Europe was gossiping about. Papal envoys who met him alone reported a mind that followed argument perfectly well. A German diplomat who expected an idiot recorded instead a courteous man who asked precise questions about affairs in the north. His confessors described long, coherent conversations. The gap between the rumor and the testimony of the people in the room with him is the widest such gap in any European reign, and the rumor won because the rumor traveled and the testimony sat in archives. He was not brilliant. He had been given almost no education, and that was done to him, not chosen by him. Within those limits he worked, and he knew the limits better than anyone. The clearest window into the man is the marriage everyone assumed would be a formality. Marie-Louise of Orleans did not want to come. She was the favorite niece of Louis XIV, raised in the most glittering court in Europe, and when the Spanish match was announced, she went to her uncle and begged him to release her from it. The story that survives has Louis answering that he could have done no better for his own daughter. She wept on the journey south. Every French account of her departure agrees that she traveled to Madrid expecting a life sentence. What she found was a husband who adored her from the first meeting and never stopped. He met her before the appointed ceremony because he could not wait. He gave her horses when the Spanish court thought a queen should not ride. He defended her French servants against a nobility that despised them, endured the etiquette battles that followed, and, when she was homesick, he arranged entertainments and hunts and small comforts against the advice of everyone around him. Ambassadors who despised almost everything about the Spanish court noted the marriage with something close to embarrassment because it was plainly a happy one, and it was not supposed to be. She never conceived, and the pressure on her was relentless, and it came from the court rather than from him. She died on the 12th of February, 1689, after 2 days of violent abdominal pain, at 26 years old. He was at her bedside. Contemporary reports describe him afterwards in a state his household had never seen. He shut himself away. He wept openly in front of men who had never seen a Spanish king weep, and he ordered her body taken to the Escorial with honors beyond what protocol required. The detail that stays with you comes later. Years afterwards, near the end of his own life, Charles ordered her tomb opened. He went down into the vault and looked at her. Then he had it closed, and he said that he would soon be with her. His second marriage was arranged for him within months, and he did his duty in it, and he never spoke of the second wife the way he had spoken of the first. Everything about that man's public existence was decided by other people. Where he lived, whom he married, what was put in his mouth, what was done to his body. There is one recorded occasion when he stopped it. It happened in the last years when the confessor, Froilan Diaz, and the exorcism faction had persuaded much of the court that the king was under a spell, and they pressed him to continue the rituals and submit to further examination. A council was assembled. The proposals were read out over his bed as though the man in it were furniture. And Charles, who had spent his whole life being discussed in the third person by people standing 2 steps away, answered them. He said he knew what was said of him. He said that many desired his death, and that God had not yet granted it, and that they should therefore attend to the business of the kingdom. Then he dismissed them. There is a version of that moment in every family and every hospital corridor in the world. The person everyone has been talking over, quietly making it known that they have heard every word. He had heard 40 years of it. He answered once in a sentence, and it was the sentence of a man who had understood his own situation with complete clarity the entire time. After that, the exorcism faction lost ground at court, and the confessor who had driven it was eventually arrested. The final proof of his judgment is the last act of his reign, and it is the one historians who dislike him have the most trouble explaining away. By the end of the 1690s, every court in Europe had accepted that Charles would die without a child, and the question of who inherited the Spanish Empire had become the largest political problem in the world. 2 claimants stood in front of him. One was the Archduke Charles of Austria, his own family, his mother's house, the dynasty he belonged to and had been raised to serve. The other was Philip of Anjou, the second grandson of Louis XIV of France, the king whose armies had invaded his territories repeatedly across 4 decades, the man he had every personal reason to hate. He took counsel seriously and slowly. He consulted the Council of State. He sought the opinion of Pope Innocent XII. He weighed the one factor that mattered above every family loyalty: which choice would keep the Spanish Empire whole. Austria could not defend Spain from France. France could defend Spain from everyone. And there were partition treaties already drafted in London and The Hague that proposed to carve up his kingdoms between the powers while he was still breathing. On the 2nd of October, 1700, he signed his final will. It named Philip of Anjou, grandson of his lifelong enemy, as heir to the whole of the Spanish monarchy, undivided, on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain never join. He chose against his own blood, against the family that had made his body what it was, in favor of the arrangement most likely to keep his people under one crown. Every serious historian of the succession now regards it as the correct strategic decision available to Spain at that moment, and it was made by a dying man of 38, whom Europe had spent his entire life describing as incapable of understanding anything. He signed it in his own hand, as he had signed everything. Within a year, the largest war Europe had ever fought was underway, and the last will of the last Habsburg king of Spain had set the whole continent on fire. He died on the 1st of November 1700, 5 days before his 39th birthday, in the same palace where he had been born. The chamber was crowded, as protocol demanded. He had asked to be shown the bodies of his family in the vault of the Escorial some time before, and he had been. Death came slowly, over weeks of swelling, seizures, and failing kidneys, and the physicians who had bled him for 35 years bled him again in the final days. 200 years of marriage contracts came to their conclusion in that bed, and the arithmetic did not need a single villain to arrive there. His last recorded words to his ministers concerned the kingdom rather than himself. He asked that his subjects be governed justly, and he asked to be left in peace. The man who had spent his whole life being discussed over his own head made his final request in the first person, and it was granted. The next day, the physicians opened his body, and the document they produced is the one this story has been walking toward from the beginning. It has to be read for what it is, a period record, written in the language of 17th century medicine, by men with no microscope and no chemistry, describing what they saw with their eyes. They reported that the body contained not a single drop of blood. They reported that the heart appeared the size of a peppercorn. They wrote that the lungs were corroded, the intestines rotten and gangrenous, that there were 3 large stones in one kidney, and that a single blackened testicle was found. They noted that the head was full of water. Those phrases have been quoted in every history of the reign for 300 years, and almost every one of them is a description rather than a diagnosis. A body drained by repeated bleeding and by days of dying will present very little liquid blood at autopsy. A heart described as tiny is a heart shrunk by the observer's expectation as much as by disease. Water in the head could mean hydrocephalus, or it could mean the ordinary fluid any anatomist finds and no one in that room had been trained to expect. Modern physicians have tried to name what killed him, and they have not agreed. One widely cited proposal argues for 2 inherited disorders arriving together: a hormone deficiency that stunted growth and left him infertile, alongside a kidney disease that produced the blood in his urine and the swelling of his last years. Others read the record as a lifetime of untreated seizures and infections in a body weakened by malnutrition from birth. Some argue that no retrospective diagnosis is possible at all from a document written by men who thought disease was an imbalance of fluids. What is not in dispute is the pedigree. The relationship between that pedigree and that body is the most thoroughly documented case of its kind in European history, and it is the reason his name appears in genetics textbooks written 3 centuries after his funeral. Then the bill arrived, and it was not paid by him. The will naming Philip of Anjou was opened and read in Madrid within days of the death, and Louis XIV accepted it for his grandson. England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria refused to accept a France and a Spain governed by the same family, and the War of the Spanish Succession began the following year. It ran from 1701 to 1714. 13 years. The armies of half of Europe fought it. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet, battles that killed tens of thousands of men in single afternoons, fought across Flanders, Germany, Italy, Spain itself, and out into the Caribbean and the Americas. Barcelona was besieged and eventually stormed. Catalonia lost its ancient liberties in the settlement. The war exhausted France, ruined Spanish finances for a generation, and killed something in the order of 1 million people across the continent, though no figure from that century can be trusted precisely. The Treaty of Utrecht ended it in 1714. Philip kept Spain and the Americas and renounced any claim to the French throne. Spain lost the Netherlands, Naples, Milan, Sardinia, Sicily, Minorca, and Gibraltar. The empire that had once been the largest on Earth stepped down to the second rank of European powers and never climbed back. A single childless body had rearranged the map of the world, and the reason that body was childless had been written into marriage contracts 150 years before the first shot was fired. The dynasty ended with him. No Habsburg has sat on the Spanish throne since the 1st of November, 1700. The famous jaw vanished from Spanish royal portraiture immediately afterwards, and it vanished for the simplest reason imaginable. There was nobody left in that line to inherit it. The Bourbons who followed brought different faces and a wider gene pool, and within 2 generations the profile that had defined the most powerful family in Europe existed only in paintings. If this kind of history holds your attention, subscribing keeps it coming. Which brings the story back to where it started, in a gallery in Madrid. The Carreno portrait still hangs. Look at it now with everything you know. The painter was working under the eye of a family that wanted the record made, and he made it as gently as the truth allowed. He lightened the eyes. He shortened the chin. He left the mouth open because the mouth would not close, and no amount of oil paint was going to close it. That family paid for the portrait. It paid for all of them, for Maximilian, for Charles V, who complained that he could not chew, for Philip II behind his beard, for Philip IV under the brush of Velasquez. 5 generations commissioned the visual record of their own decline, hung it in their own halls, and walked past it every day. Somebody made this happen, and it is worth being precise about who was in the room. The men who negotiated the marriages knew the family had been marrying inward for a century because they wrote the degrees of kinship into the paperwork themselves. The church granted the dispensations every time, and its own canon law existed because the consequences of close kin marriage had been observed for 1,000 years. The physicians attended the births and the small funerals and never once put the 2 things on the same page. The ambassadors of Europe wrote home about the sickly Spanish princes for 4 generations and used the information to plan wars rather than to warn anybody. None of them had genetics. All of them had eyes, and a family archive, and the evidence of a nursery. Where the line falls between not knowing and not wanting to know is the question this story leaves open, and no historian has ever closed it. What can be said plainly is the smaller thing, and it belongs to one man rather than to a dynasty. He was crowned before he could walk. He was treated by the finest doctors in the world, and every treatment made him worse. He was written about as a strategic liability by every court in Europe, prayed over as a man possessed, blamed for a body assembled before he existed, and given a nickname that outlived his empire. Within all of that, he loved one woman completely, signed his own papers with a hand that would not hold steady, listened to his ministers when he could have let others listen for him, and made the last decision of his life clearly. The jaw ended in Madrid. In Vienna, the same blood kept signing the same contracts for another 200 years, and the family there had learned nothing at all. He was not the bewitched king. He was the last one.
What gets to me about this story is that nobody in it was evil. The doctors bled him because that was medicine. The advisors arranged marriages because that was statecraft. The priests blessed it all because that was their law. And somehow, a single man died in his own body like a prisoner, and a war that followed killed 1 million more. The one thing I keep coming back to is whether they couldn't see it or just chose not to. Write in the comments, how do you read it?